Hey guys, tonight we drift softly through silken corridors and beyond the linen-draped thresholds of royal chambers, places where candlelight dances across walls the color of old parchment, where gold catches fire in the hush, and where whispers, once shared beneath painted ceilings, still seem to hover in the air like perfumed smoke. But let us not be carried away too quickly by visions of romance. This is not the version found in films or fairy tales. The truth of royal intimacy was rarely simple. It was rarely soft. It was watched, recorded, expected. There was little privacy, even less freedom and desire, often bowed beneath the weight of dynasty, diplomacy, and fear. You see, to lie with a pharaoh, or to be one, meant carrying generations of expectation in your breath. Sex was not simply an act, it was ritual, strategy, sometimes a spectacle, and sometimes a quiet rebellion behind a locked door. So before we step too far inside, allow yourself a moment. If you found comfort here, in these stories and this stillness, you're welcome to stay a while. You can gently subscribe if that feels right. And perhaps, if you'd like, leave a note of where you're listening from, whether it's beneath the rising sun in Kyoto or the soft blue quiet of midnight in Toronto. Now, if you haven't already, dim the lights. Let your room soften. Let the fan hum gently nearby like a whisper from another age. And together, we'll slip into the hidden hush of history's most intimate chambers. Let's begin. The sun slips behind the dunes now, casting long shadows across the Nile. The heat of the day fades gently, like a candle burning low, and the breeze from the river carries the scent of silt and distant fig trees. Along the riverbank, where papyrus grows in soft tufts and the water laps lazily at mud brick walls, life slows. It has always done so for thousands of years. The rhythm of ancient Egypt is not one of speed or urgency, but of cyclical calm, predictable, timeless, and warm. And here, in the blue dusk of this eternal evening, we wander. Not into the palaces of kings or the stone temples of gods, but into the intimate spaces where ordinary Egyptians closed their eyes, whispered to lovers, and rested their bodies against the soft hush of linen sheets. Let us step quietly into their world. The door is made of palm wood. The hinges creak gently. The walls are cool to the touch, made from thick mud brick, designed to trap the chill of the night after the sun's unforgiving gaze has lifted. Homes in ancient Egypt were not grand for most. They were modest, functional, and wise in their design. But within those homes, there were places of tenderness, places of skin against skin, of laughter behind closed doors, of children conceived and dreams spoken aloud in the safety of darkness. The bed, though, was not the plush, towering thing we imagine today. It was low to the ground, a wooden frame, often handcrafted by the very people who slept on it. Strips of cord or leather or woven reeds formed a loose net across the frame, the mattress, so to speak. For the poor, there might be no cushion at all, just that stretched surface, softened by time and use, covered with a linen sheet. But linen in Egypt was prized, spun from flax, bleached by the sun, and often smoothed with stones until it felt nearly weightless. Even simple linen had a cool, sacred feel. And the air at night, dry and serene, made it easy to drift into sleep with little more than that thin layer wrapped around you. Some of the wealthier classes had pillows, though the word may not conjure what you expect. Instead of soft feathers or cotton, many headrests were carved from wood, alabaster, or even ivory, shaped like an elegant crescent cradling the base of the skull. They were thought to preserve one's hairstyle overnight, but also to keep the head elevated and cool, free from the crawl of insects or the dust of the floor. And in a world where dreams were believed to carry messages from the divine, perhaps it helped keep the mind closer to the gods. The room itself was simple, a few clay oil lamps flickering low, perhaps a basket of dates or dried fish left unfinished from the evening's meal, a stool or a jar of water resting by the doorway. For those with more means, perfume jars might be nestled into niches in the wall, alongside coal containers, combs carved from bone, and small statues of protective spirits. The god Bes, for example, short, bearded, lion-faced, stood guard over bedrooms. He was no mighty warrior or imposing deity. He was comical, wild-haired, tongue out, but loved. He chased away nightmares, protected babies, and ensured peace within the bedchamber. He was the patron of rest, of fertility, and of joy without shame. Because here in this world, the bed was not a place of secrecy, nor was it one of guilt. Sex in ancient Egypt was not hidden behind curtains of shame or steeped in taboo. It was a part of life, like baking bread, or tending goats, or sweeping dust from the floor. It was practical, of course, necessary for lineage, for property rights, for the birth of sons and daughters who would carry a family name. But it was also pleasurable, joyful, even sacred. The gods themselves were sexual beings, and their unions were depicted on temple walls, not with vulgarity, but with symbolism, reverence, and a kind of innocent earthiness. Take, for example, the story of Isis and Osiris, among the most sacred myths in all of Egyptian lore. When Osiris was killed and dismembered by his brother Set, it was Isis who gathered his body, piece by piece, and used her magic to restore him. She crafted a phallus from gold, as it was the only part she could not recover, and with it she conceived Horus. That act, a mythic, loving union in the shadow of death, was not seen as grotesque, but as an act of divine love and regeneration. To make love was to create life. To create life was to align with the gods. Even in more mundane settings, love and sex were part of the fabric of daily life. Young people courted in the streets, in the marketplaces, along the banks of the river. A glance, a gesture, a shared piece of fruit, these were the beginnings of romance. And when they found each other, when two hearts beat softly in time beneath the moonlight, they came together not in a blaze of passion, but in the quiet of knowing. Two bodies warmed by the same day's sun, two souls lulled by the same distant croaking of frogs and the murmur of reeds. There were rituals, yes, herbs for arousal, ointments, love spells, carefully inked onto papyrus and buried in the ground, or chanted softly over a fire. But mostly there was simplicity, touch, scent, the nearness of breath, and bed, humble as they were, bore witness to all of it. Children often shared sleeping quarters with their parents, especially in smaller homes. But it was not uncommon for couples to find moments of privacy, even in the crowded labyrinth of domestic life. A quiet corner, a woven curtain drawn, a rooftop under the stars. Egyptian homes often had flat roofs, useful for drying laundry, storing goods, or escaping the heat of the day. But at night, under the wide bowl of stars and the ever-listening moon, they became sanctuaries for lovers. Cool air brushing bare skin, the hush of the city below, the slow rhythmic pulse of intimacy in the dark. And though we might think of romance as the province of the young, ancient Egyptian love spanned decades. Marriage, while not always formally officiated, was rooted in companionship. Couples lived together, raised children, tended to the same goats and grapevines. They grieved together, aged together. Tomb inscriptions tell us of husbands who wrote with deep longing to their wives, long after death had separated them. Love was not fleeting. It was a thread woven through the entire span of life. Still, not all relationships were gentle. Ancient texts also hint at jealousy, betrayal, and heartbreak. There are records of love spells meant to lure a straying partner back, of warnings scrawled in frustration. But even in that, there is something deeply human, a reminder that the people who lived along the Nile were not so different from us. They too lay awake some nights, hearts pounding, wondering if they were truly loved. They too reached out for warmth, for comfort, for the reassurance of a body beside their own. And so the bedchamber, humble or grand, shaded or moonlit, was a place of honesty, of dreams whispered against collarbones, of fingers tracing old scars, of new life conceived and old stories shared. It was here that generations began, that secrets were told, that gods were honored in acts of intimacy. It is easy to think of the ancient world as a place of ceremony and spectacle, of towering pyramids and rigid social hierarchies. But if you look closely, behind the sandstone and the gilded coffins, you'll find a world of quiet, personal rituals. A husband smoothing his wife's hair as she drifts to sleep. A young woman placing a fresh reed mat beside her bed in hopes of dreaming of her beloved. A man lighting a lamp just to see his partner's face one last time before slumber takes him. The bedchambers of ancient Egypt held all of this. They were not grand halls or stages for passion. They were simply home, warm, fragrant, soft in the way only things worn by love can be. And in those small spaces, under canopies of linen or the open sky, the people of the Nile did what people everywhere have always done. They loved, they slept, they dreamed. So let us linger here a while longer in the hush of that ancient night. Let us imagine the weight of linen against the skin, the flicker of a single flame casting dancing shadows on a clay wall, the creak of a wooden bed frame as two lovers shift gently into sleep, the slow inhale and exhale of two lives wrapped around one another. Outside, the Nile moves steadily on, its current slow, constant, like the breath of the world. And within, in homes both grand and simple, the people rest, beneath the stars, beneath the watchful eyes of Bes and Hathor, beneath the weight of centuries that will one day forget their names, but not their longing, nor their love. Night has settled like silk. The warmth of the Egyptian day has softened into a quiet hush, and from the corners of the sleeping city, a low breeze sighs through open courtyards. Somewhere, an oil lamp flickers. The flame leans slightly in the draught, illuminating the curved lip of a pottery jar and casting long, gentle shadows on the wall. The light smells faintly of animal fat and resin. But in the corners of the room, a different scent lingers. Something sweeter. A waft of crushed myrrh or a dried flower laid carefully beside a sleeping mat. The ghost of a perfume that was once worn close to the neck, or behind the ear, or along the inside of a wrist. In ancient Egypt, love did not begin in the bed. It began with the senses. The Egyptians lived in a world defined by fragrance. Scent was not an afterthought. It was the opening note to a symphony of presence. A woman stepping through a doorway might bring with her the heady richness of frankincense. A man walking home from the fields might smell of sweet grass and sand, his skin warmed by sun, his tunic clinging to him with the breath of long labor. Scent was identity. Scent was seduction. Scent was sacred. Let us go back again, not to a temple or tomb, but to a private chamber just after sunset. A woman sits before a low table, carved smooth by use, its surface scattered with delicate jars. The jars are made of alabaster, some of calcite, others ceramic with hand-painted lotus flowers curling around the base. Her fingers are quick but careful. She opens a jar, dips into the thick, amber-colored salve inside and rubs it gently along her neck. The air fills with the warm, spicy fragrance of cinnamon and honey. Another jar holds a resin distilled from the bark of balsam trees. Another, an oil pressed from blue lotus blossoms. Perfume was not merely cosmetic, it was magical, spiritual, a bridge between the human body and the divine. The gods were believed to smell beautiful, not in the way flowers smell, but in a way that is impossible to describe and impossible to forget. Sweet, yes, but also powerful. Clean, yes, but also intoxicating. To smell good was to be near godliness. It was to glow invisibly in the senses of those around you. This is why, during banquets, men and women alike often wore small cones of scented wax upon their heads, a kind of perfumed headdress. These cones would slowly melt over the course of the evening, releasing fragrant oil down the hair and over the shoulders. It was sensual, yes, but also deeply pleasurable in the body. The wax softened in the heat of laughter, of conversation, of music, and by the end of the night, it had anointed the skin like a blessing. Imagine this scene now. A banquet in the open air, palm trees rustling faintly overhead, torches set in the ground around the perimeter. The scent of roasted duck drifts through the air, mingling with that of spiced wine. Laughter drifts across the garden. Somewhere, a musician plays a harp. Women recline on woven mats, their eyes painted with kohl, their bodies glistening under thin linen garments. A man leans closer to whisper something. His scent reaches her first. It is musk and cassia and the dusty sweetness of myrrh. These scents, though beautiful, were not invented for pleasure alone. Many had ritual significance. Frankincense, for instance, was burned in temples to purify the space, to prepare the body and soul for communion with higher forces. The same resins used to anoint a lover's body were used to anoint the dead, to call down blessings, to cleanse sacred places. And yet, it is this very overlap between the holy and the human that gives Egyptian sensuality its unmistakable character. There was no rigid divide between the spiritual and the sensual. A kiss could be a prayer, a perfume could be an offering. A body, cleaned and dressed with care, could be both a vessel of love and a symbol of cosmic order. One scent, above all, stood out as the most sensual: the blue lotus. It is hard to describe the significance of the blue lotus without slipping into poetry. This flower, with its delicate petals and intoxicating fragrance, grew along the banks of the Nile, rising each morning to greet the sun and folding itself again at dusk. To the Egyptians, it was more than a plant. It was a metaphor for rebirth, for beauty, for seduction. The blue lotus was often soaked in wine to create a mildly narcotic beverage. Those who drank it described a floating feeling, the world softening at the edges, everything bathed in golden warmth. In art, blue lotuses appear again and again in scenes of love and pleasure. Women hold them to their noses. Lovers exchange them. Gods sit beside pools of them. It is the flower of twilight intimacy, of slow caresses and shared silences. Beyond perfume and potion, the Egyptians also practiced magic in love. Love spells were not seen as manipulative, but as hopeful, gestures of longing. A young girl might write a spell on a piece of linen, knot it carefully, and bury it near a door to invite the attention of a specific boy. A woman might whisper an incantation over a lamp flame, calling the name of the one she desired, asking the gods to bring him in dreams. Men, too, sought the aid of spirits. A wax figure might be carved and hidden in a corner of a lover's home, its arms folded, its eyes painted wide with longing. These charms weren't always meant to change the will of another. Often they were confessions made to the universe, prayers in disguise. Quiet, private admissions that one's heart had grown too full to bear in silence. And still, for all the magic, for all the perfume and spells, the most common form of adornment was the body itself. The Egyptians loved beauty, but not in the rigid, idealized sense we often assume. They loved softness. They loved curves. They loved expression. Women oiled their skin to make it shimmer in the sun. Men trimmed their beards, wore amulets close to their chests, and walked barefoot through the cool dust. Eyes were lined not just to attract, but to protect, the dark coal thought to shield against both glare and malevolent forces. The body was a canvas of daily ritual, to cleanse it, to scent it, to decorate it. These acts were not vanity, they were devotion. Each step was a way of saying, I am alive, I am worthy, I am here. And when two bodies met, in the hush of a private room, or the cool shade of a sycamore tree, or in a bed of woven reeds, they brought their rituals with them. The perfumes, the charms, the laughter softened by wine. They brought the sun on their skin and the gods in their breath. And they loved one another, not only with passion, but with care. The act of love, when depicted in Egyptian art, is rarely crude. Even when bold, it is gentle. There is a lightness to the way figures touch, a serenity in the curve of limbs. It is not domination, it is presence, connection, trust. Even the erotic Turin papyrus, one of the most explicit pieces of ancient art ever found, is laced with humor and exaggeration, with lovers caught in joyful, absurd positions, more celebratory than salacious. It reminds us that for all their sacredness, the Egyptians did not take pleasure too seriously. They enjoyed it. They played. They knew that laughter, too, was a form of affection. At the heart of it all was balance, the Egyptian ideal of ma'at, order, harmony, truth. Pleasure was not indulgent if it did not disrupt this balance. Sensuality was not dangerous if it served love, family, or beauty. Perfume, sex, laughter, adornment. These were not threats to spiritual life. They were its fragrant, golden threads. And so as we sit now, in the soft dark of this imagined room, we inhale the ghosts of these scents. The blue lotus, lingering like memory. The resin of sweet acacia. The oil of marjoram. We hear the echo of laughter in the courtyard. The soft footstep of someone entering. The faint creak of a bed as it shifts. And we understand the people of ancient Egypt lived not in opposition to the sensual, but in harmony with it. They wore their desire with grace. They anointed it with sacred oils. They whispered it into lamps, tied it into charms, kissed it into flesh. The stars above the Nile do not blink or shimmer. They hang heavy and still, as if watching, as if listening. The night is quiet now. The sounds of trade and toil long since silenced, replaced by the rhythmic hush of crickets and the distant croak of frogs near the river's edge. In the dim corners of villages and cities alike, oil lamps gutter low. Smoke curls lazily toward soot-stained ceilings. And in one small home, just like thousands of others, a woman places her hand over her stomach and whispers a prayer. In ancient Egypt, fertility was not merely a fact of biology. It was the pulse of civilization. The silent contract between earth and river, between womb and cosmos. Each stalk of barley, each mewing infant, each heartbeat in the quiet dark, was seen as evidence of divine favor. Life was not something one simply possessed. It was something given. And just as easily, it could be withheld. To be fertile was to be aligned with the will of the gods. It was to be blessed with continuity, with the ability to pass something forward, a name, a legacy, a harvest, a hope. And so the rituals surrounding fertility were not frantic or superstitious, but tender, deeply rooted, performed slowly, with reverence, often in silence, as though the very act of hoping too loudly might frighten the gods away. In the earliest years of womanhood, young girls would learn from their mothers and aunts how the body changed, how to care for it, how to read its signs. There were no textbooks, no clinical diagrams, only stories, only observations passed down like heirlooms. Blood was not feared but understood, a sign of ripening, a small death that promised life to come. There were herbs to ease pain, ointments made from myrrh or honey or crocodile dung, each believed to restore balance or prevent unwanted conception. There were amulets strung on linen cords, carried close to the womb, invoking the protection of Hathor, Isis, or Taweret. Taweret, the great hippopotamus goddess with a crocodile tail and lion's paws, may not strike modern eyes as gentle, but to the ancient Egyptians, she was comfort incarnate. She stood at the thresholds of birth, her belly swollen like that of the women she guarded. Her gaze was fierce, not toward the mothers, but toward anything that threatened them. Her image adorned birthing bricks, bedposts, even knives used to cut umbilical cords. She was the first to be called upon in moments of labor, the last to be thanked when mother and child survived. And yet, childbirth in ancient Egypt was always a journey through uncertainty. Midwives, experienced and calm, attended births with a quiet authority. They came not with scalpels or tools, but with warm hands, herbs, and words that had been spoken 1,000 times before. Words of comfort, words to distract, words to summon courage from a place buried deep within the body. A laboring woman might squat on 2 bricks, painted and inscribed with protective deities, gripping a rope hanging from the ceiling or a tree branch brought inside for the occasion. Sometimes she knelt. Sometimes she leaned into the arms of another woman. The midwives sang, chanted. They placed beads in her palm and whispered charms over her breath. The floor beneath her was prepared with care, cleaned, scented, warmed with linen cloths and smoothed reeds. When the child came, he or she was greeted not with a slap, but with oil, with salt, with prayer. The cord was cut with flint, then the newborn wrapped and placed beside the mother, who was not simply exhausted, but radiant, changed. The moment of birth was a holy event, a mirror of divine creation. For in their mythology, the Egyptians told stories of cosmic birth that mirrored human labor. The world itself, they believed, had been born from the chaotic waters of Nun. From this primordial sea emerged the first mound of land, and atop it, in some versions, Atum, the self-created god, brought forth life from his own body. In others, it was the goddess Nut, stretched across the sky, whose union with Geb, the earth, produced the deities who populated the cosmos. Nut herself was often painted across tomb ceilings, her long, arching form swallowing the sun each night, only to birth it again each morning from between her thighs. To be born was to be part of this eternal rhythm. To give birth was to momentarily become the goddess herself. No wonder, then, that fertility was not treated with shame, but with reverence. Even the tools of conception, the act of sex itself, was held in esteem. There was no sin in pleasure, no guilt in desire. A man and a woman seeking to conceive might anoint themselves with perfumed oils. They might share wine laced with blue lotus. They might invoke the gods with offerings before lying together in the soft glow of lamplight. It wasn't always so poetic, of course. Not every coupling was tender, not every child was welcomed. But the cultural framework, the scaffolding that held everything in place, was one of respect. The womb was a place of miracles. Its health and vitality were subjects of medicine, of prayer, and of quiet awe. Men too had their roles. Fertility tests were recorded in papyri, primitive by modern standards, but methodical in their way. A woman might urinate on wheat and barley seeds. If the grain sprouted, it was believed she was pregnant. In some versions, the type of grain that grew could predict the child's gender. There were also amulets and potions prescribed to men to enhance potency, to ensure virility, to protect the seed from being lost. Yet for all the medical curiosity, the mystery of fertility remained intact. The Egyptians did not claim to fully understand it. They bowed to it, respected it, repeated its rituals not to control it, but to honor its unpredictable grace. Those who could not conceive were not always shunned, though the pressure was certainly present. A woman without children might be pitied, her marriage strained. And yet, adoption was not uncommon. Nor was the raising of nieces, nephews, or even servant children as one's own. Kinship was elastic, and love, though not always loud, could be expansive. The royal class, of course, treated fertility with a different kind of urgency. The birth of an heir was not only a personal joy, it was a political necessity. Pharaohs took multiple wives to ensure offspring, and queens, though revered, were often reduced in historical texts to their reproductive achievements. Still, among these women were powerful figures, queens like Ahmose Nefertari, Tiye and Nefertari, whose names echo not just as mothers, but as matriarchs, diplomats, and de facto rulers. In some temples you can still find carvings of divine birth scenes. Pharaohs depicted as born not from mortal wombs, but from the gods themselves. This was not hubris, it was theology. To rule was to descend from the gods, and so their conception had to be equally divine. A story, yes, but also a framework to understand power, legacy, and the sacredness of lineage. For the average woman, however, motherhood was neither mythic nor symbolic. It was physical, it was lived. Her days were filled with tending, teaching, feeding. Her nights were spent nursing or soothing a child back to sleep. The family slept close, often in the same room or even the same bed. Privacy was rare, but affection was common. Children were kissed, held, sung to. Fathers, especially in the New Kingdom period, were often depicted playing with toddlers, cradling infants, guiding small hands as they learned to walk. There was tenderness, there was fatigue, there was joy. But not all stories ended in celebration. Infant mortality was high. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and the deaths of young mothers in labor were all too common. And so, the rituals surrounding birth were also steeped in protection. Amulets of Bes, the dwarf god with lion's mane, were worn around the neck or tied to a cradle. Spells were spoken at dawn. Offerings were made at shrines. When loss came, as it so often did, it was not hidden. Mourning was visible, vocal. Women tore their garments, anointed themselves with ashes, and wept openly. Grief was not a private burden, but a communal wound. And yet, even in mourning, there was ritual. There was a belief in reunion, in the continuity of the soul, in the idea that a child lost might still await the mother in the field of reeds. That eternal paradise where all things lost would be found again. In this way, fertility was never just about birth. It was about connection, between past and future, between earth and sky, between the mortal body and the divine cycle it mirrored. And in the quiet moments, when a woman stood alone in a doorway and placed a hand on her belly, or when a man carved a tiny figure to place beside his sleeping wife, or when a child, just weaned, offered a piece of bread to the god Bes with sticky fingers, in these moments, the true heart of ancient Egyptian fertility was revealed. It was not in the temples, not in the myths, not even in the blood and water of labor. It was in the daily gestures, the the long glances, the whispered prayers, the acts of care so small they might have seemed invisible, but to the gods nothing was invisible. And so, tonight, as the Nile winds quietly past the sleeping homes of long-forgotten families, we imagine the shape of a mother's hand resting on a child's chest, the warmth of two lovers curled beside a flickering flame, the scent of new linen laid out in hope, and the dreams of those who, centuries ago, closed their eyes and wished to create something, anything, that would outlast them. Not in opposition to the sensual, but in harmony with it. They wore their desire with grace. They anointed it with sacred oils. They whispered it into lamps, tied it into charms, kissed it into flesh. The sun, like a bronze disk, lingers just above the horizon, casting its honey-colored warmth across the fields of wheat and barley. The Nile stretches alongside, glistening, calm, winding its slow, ancient path between villages built of mud brick and palm wood. The day's labor is nearly finished. You can hear it in the distant rhythm of a sickle slicing grain, the clatter of donkey hooves against dry stone, the low murmur of merchants packing up their stalls. But in the quieter corners of the village, another kind of rhythm continues, softer, unmeasured, and timeless. It's the rhythm of glances passed across a courtyard, of fingers brushing briefly at the well, of words carried on the breeze that say little but mean everything. This is where love lived for most Egyptians, not in royal palaces or temples carved into cliffs, but in the dusty streets and small rooms of the everyday. Theirs was a love that grew beside chores and ripened like figs in the heat of the sun, slowly, without spectacle, and with a tenderness so ordinary that history almost forgot it. But if you listen carefully, if you lean in close to the softest parts of their lives, you'll find it still beating. A young woman leans against the doorway of her family home. She has flour on her arms and a slight sheen of sweat on her forehead from tending the oven. Across the street, a boy about her age is driving a pair of goats through the alley. Their eyes meet and hold. She doesn't smile, not at first. But something in the set of her mouth changes, a spark flickering just beneath the surface. The boy, pretending to adjust a rope, lingers longer than necessary before moving on. Tomorrow, they'll see each other again, and again. And slowly, a ritual will begin. Love for the ordinary Egyptian was rarely dramatic. It was woven into daily life. Shared meals, stolen fruit, a reed flute played too loud and too long just to catch someone's attention. Marriage wasn't always arranged. While economic considerations and family reputation played a role, especially among the wealthy, there is ample evidence that ordinary people often chose their partners, or at least hoped to. Love poetry from the New Kingdom period tells us so. These aren't the works of priests or scholars. They're the songs of farmers, fishermen, weavers. Their words preserved on bits of pottery and scrap papyrus, sometimes scribbled in the margins of larger texts. They are clumsy, sweet, and sometimes wildly sensual. One poem reads, "7 times I walk past her house. Not to see her, no, of course not, just to hear her dog bark, just to smell her bread." Another, from a woman's perspective, says, "He is near, yet does not speak. I am the jar, he is the water. I wait for him to fill me." These are not abstract declarations. They are earthy, familiar, and in them we find not the grandeur of mythic love, but the intimacy of recognition. The kind of longing that makes a person comb their hair with extra care, that makes them find reasons to linger at the market or pick out the ripest fig to leave near someone's doorstep. When couples finally came together, there was often little in the way of ceremony. Marriage did not require temples or priests. It was, more often than not, a practical agreement between two people to live together and share a household. The act of cohabiting was enough to signal a union. A gift might be exchanged, a necklace, a bundle of grain, perhaps a small animal. And once the couple was together, they were referred to as husband and wife in both legal and social contexts. But that simplicity should not be mistaken for a lack of feeling. Letters survive from husbands to wives and wives to husbands, filled with a kind of devotion that is startling in its softness. A man writes, "Do not worry. I have bought 2 fish and honey, and shall be home by nightfall. I miss the way you sleep, your feet always cold, your mouth half open." A wife replying, "The house is quiet without you. The geese do not laugh the same way. Even the cat, stupid as she is, waits by the door." These letters weren't written for history. They weren't grand performances. They were scraps of real affection, folded and carried close to the heart, tucked between chores, meals, and life's many small demands. Within the home, gender roles were somewhat flexible. While men often worked in trades, fields, or administration, women controlled the household, not just as caretakers, but as managers. They kept the accounts, organized goods, taught the children, and sometimes even ran small businesses from the home. A strong woman was not feared. She was respected. Love was not about dominance. It was about partnership. That said, affection was often expressed through action rather than words. A man might prepare water for his wife to bathe. A woman might mend her husband's sandals before he asked. They slept together, often alongside their children in small, shared spaces. Privacy was rare, but intimacy was not dependent on privacy. It was found in the gentle way someone turned down a sheet, in the way one body curved naturally toward another after a long day's work. Even older couples, long past the blush of youth, expressed a quiet, enduring love. Archaeological remains have uncovered couples buried side by side, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes facing one another, the final pose of a lifelong embrace. Their names were etched into stone, often followed by simple phrases: "His beloved," "her heart," "the one who made me laugh." And of course, not every love story was simple. Some were complicated. There were jealousies, betrayals, estrangements. Women could initiate divorce, and did. Men could be taken to court for abandoning their families. Love, like life, was not always easy, but even in its messiness it was acknowledged, not hidden away. Among the elite, love often intertwined with duty. Pharaohs and nobles married to cement alliances or preserve bloodlines. But even here, affection bloomed. Ramses II called his queen Nefertari the one for whom the sun rises. Their temple at Abu Simbel, rare for its equal emphasis on a royal wife, stands as stone testament to a love that surpassed politics. Nefertiti and Akhenaten, too, are often depicted touching tenderly in art. A rare gesture in formal portraiture of the time. Their daughters gather around them. The mood is familial, warm, almost modern. But perhaps most beautiful of all are the anonymous loves. The ones history didn't preserve in names or marble, but in gesture. A man brushing ash from his wife's face after tending the oven. A woman braiding her husband's hair before a feast. A child slipping between them at night, arms outstretched, safe in the space where love had already lived for years. These are the moments that built Egypt. Not just the pyramids, or the laws, or the wars, but the hands held in quiet, the eyes that searched for one another in a crowd, the homes built of mud and filled with tenderness. There were no vows to obey, no doctrines of submission. There was simply living, together, day after day. And in the end, when the final sleep came, the desire to remain together did not end. Tombs often include inscriptions from a husband to his wife, or vice versa, speaking across the divide of death. I wait for you in the west. I will meet you among the flowers. Come soon, beloved, come soft. And so, the love that began in the dust and noise of daily life continued, beyond the body, beyond the breath, into eternity. Let us sit with them now, just for a while. Let us imagine the warmth of a small home lit by a single flame. A woman stirring lentils, a man humming an off-key tune, a child tracing letters in the dirt, the smell of bread, the creak of a chair, the feeling of someone's hand resting on your back, not because they need anything, but because you're there. That was love, unremarkable and utterly sacred. They anointed it with sacred oils. They whispered it into lamps, tied it into charms, kissed it into flesh. The desert at night is not silent, but it is still. The wind, having raced across distant dunes for hours, slows to a whisper. It moves gently now between the stones of abandoned courtyards, through broken doorways and across the half-buried walls of old tombs. Above, the stars shine with a clarity that seems impossible, cold, fixed, and wide-eyed. You could almost believe they're watching, and maybe they are. For the ancient Egyptians, everything watched, everything listened. The sky, the sand, even the dead, especially the dead. And as we rest here, at the edge of the west, where the sun sinks and the soul's journey, we begin to understand something profound. For these people, love did not end with the final breath. It did not dissolve with the body, nor was it buried beneath the sand. It traveled onward, carefully, faithfully, like a caravan of memory moving toward a distant oasis. The afterlife, in ancient Egyptian belief, was not an abstract idea. It was tangible, detailed, and described with the same clarity one might use to give directions to a village nearby. It was called the Field of Reeds, a paradise that mirrored the best parts of Egypt. Wide green plains, cool waters, shady fig trees, and endless fields ready for harvest. There, the soul, the Ka, would continue living much as it had in this world, only without pain, without hunger, without sorrow. To reach it, one had to be judged, of course. One's heart weighed against the feather of truth, one's deeds examined. But for those who passed, and many hoped they would, and life continued, and not alone. Those you loved in life would be there, waiting. This promise, whispered in quiet moments between spouses or scribbled in the margins of a letter, was more than comfort. It was a foundation, a way of understanding life's purpose and love's endurance. In the tombs of the middle and upper classes, we find countless examples of this belief expressed with touching intimacy. Inscriptions speak not of fear, but of reunion. A husband writes, "I wait for you in the sacred place. My bread is dry, my mouth is dust. Come to me and make me whole again." A wife, carved in relief beside her husband, wears a faint smile, not of grief, but of recognition. Her hand is raised in a gesture of greeting, or perhaps farewell. The line between the two is thin, almost transparent. Death was not a wall, it was a veil. Funerary art, for all its stylized beauty, reveals a world deeply concerned with closeness. Couples are often depicted sitting side by side, hands touching, faces turned toward each other. They are not stiff or isolated, they are relaxed, connected. Even in the grave, they were meant to lie together. And so, in life, preparations were made with this continuity in mind. Burial was not just about the body, it was about the relationship. Tombs were built not only to house the deceased, but to preserve the bond between the living and the dead. Food offerings, letters, songs, and even love poems were placed in tombs, not as decoration, but as messages, as gifts. One such letter, written by a man to his departed wife, reads, "Why have you left me? The house is cold. The children are silent. I light the lamp, but see only shadow. Come in a dream. Touch my hand. Remind me that love does not rot." It is a plea raw and quiet, not for resurrection, but for presence. And according to many beliefs of the time, such pleas might be answered. Dreams were a bridge. The dead, if they were content, could visit, not as ghosts to haunt, but as spirits to comfort. A wife might appear to her widower in a dream, instructing him to remarry or gently scolding him for forgetting to maintain her shrine. A husband might kiss his wife's forehead in sleep, leaving behind only the scent of lotus and the faint warmth of memory. In this way, love remained part of the living world. It shaped behavior, informed rituals, created expectations not just for what came after death, but for how one lived in preparation for it. Couples who could afford to be buried together often were. The inscriptions on their shared tombs tell stories that range from practical to poetic. Some detail their joint accomplishments, the harvests managed, the children raised, the land purchased. Others are tender beyond words. One fragment, found in a tomb near Thebes, reads simply, "We grew old beside each other, may our hearts never part." Even those who could not afford tombs often made gestures to ensure continued connection. Clay figurines were buried with the dead, sometimes representing a spouse or child, sometimes designed to carry messages between worlds. Names were spoken aloud regularly to keep the memory alive. Meals were offered. Anniversaries were marked not with candles or cakes, but with quiet visits and whispered prayers. There was a rhythm to mourning, one not of forgetting, but of transformation. Grief did not demand closure. It invited participation. The living were not expected to move on, but to include the dead in new ways. A widow might sleep beside her husband's sandals. A widower might set a second bowl of lentils on the table, not out of delusion, out of devotion. This sense of continued relationship extended even into the structure of Egyptian religion. The gods themselves were involved in love and its endurance. Isis, in particular, was revered not just as a goddess of magic and motherhood, but as the ultimate expression of faithful love. Her story, told and retold across centuries, was one of impossible devotion. When Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set and his body scattered across Egypt, Isis searched tirelessly, gathering each piece. She reassembled her husband, breathed life into him, and conceived their son, Horus, in an act of divine union. Though Osiris could not remain in the land of the living, he ruled the afterlife, not as a ghost, but as a king. And Isis, though parted from him in body, remained eternally bound to him in purpose, in myth, and in love. To the Egyptians, this was more than a story. It was a map, a guide to how love should persist, with effort, with reverence, and with the belief that separation was never final. This belief influenced how people died, and how they were remembered. Tomb goods were chosen not only for utility in the afterlife, but for emotional resonance. A favorite tunic, a comb, a lock of a child's hair. These were not practical items, but symbols of connection. And for lovers, the most sacred offering of all was the memory of touch. One poem, etched into a piece of limestone found near a burial site, reads, "If I cannot hold you, let the linen that wrapped you remember. If I cannot kiss you, let the oils that scented you carry my breath." There is no desperation in these words, only longing shaped by ritual. And even the very architecture of tombs reinforced this hope of ongoing love. In some tombs, small openings or false doors were built into the walls, not for the living to enter, but for the spirit of the dead to pass through. Offerings were left nearby, not just to nourish the departed, but to invite them to stay near, to watch, to listen, to whisper their presence in the flicker of a flame or the rustle of reeds outside the window. Love was everywhere, not in grand gestures, but in small acts repeated, in the daily tending of memory, in the silent vow that love, once given, would not be taken back by death. This understanding shaped family life, community rituals, and even national identity. Pharaohs ordered monuments not just for themselves, but for their queens. Scribes wrote of their affection in the margins of legal texts. Laborers sang of their sweethearts while building tombs for others. Love, in all its forms, romantic, maternal, platonic, was seen as a force that did not fade. Even in the poorest graves, traces remain. Two skeletons carefully placed, fingers intertwined. A necklace broken in burial, perhaps from the tremor of grief, still laid beside the body. A cooking pot with a faint inscription, "To my beloved, so that you may always eat well." These gestures speak across time. They tell us that the people who lived along the Nile were not obsessed with grandeur. They were obsessed with continuity, with not losing each other, with finding a way to make love last, not through immortality, but through remembrance. And perhaps that is why their stories still reach us, why we lean in closer, even now, to read their poems, to trace the faded outlines of names carved into tomb walls, to imagine a man sitting on the edge of his bed holding a scrap of papyrus and whispering his wife's name into the dusk. We do this not out of curiosity, but out of kinship, because we too fear endings. We too want to be held beyond the veil. We too place photos on mantles, keep letters in drawers, say names out loud in the dark when no one else is listening. And so we sit together across centuries, beneath the same stars that once watched over the desert. We remember, we hope, we love, and in that, we are not so different from the farmers, the scribes, the queens, and the midwives of ancient Egypt. Their tombs may be filled with dust now, their temples crumbled, but the linen that once wrapped their bodies still remembers. The walls that once echoed their names still hum. The river that once carried their offerings still flows. And perhaps in some quiet corner of the field of reeds, two figures walk hand in hand, just as they did when the world was young. Not as spirits, not as shadows, but as lovers. Still, before the sun rose over the temples, before the scribes dipped their pens and the boats unfurled their sails, there were quieter beginnings. A woman stands before a burnished bronze mirror. It catches the first threads of morning light, scattering them across the room. She is not royalty. She is not a priestess. She is the wife of a brewer, the mother of two. She is alone, just for a moment, while the house still sleeps. And in that space of early hush, she performs a ritual older than the pyramids. She reaches for a small alabaster jar. It opens with a soft twist, and from within comes the rich scent of marjoram oil. Not strong, not sharp, but warm, like skin on sun-warmed linen. She dips two fingers in, applies it to the crook of her elbows, her collarbone, the backs of her knees. Then another jar, blue lotus, pressed and aged into a thick resin, dabbed behind her ears. And finally, a coal stick, ground galena mixed with fat and soot. With practiced grace, she draws it across the rim of each eye, not for fashion, not for vanity, but for tradition, for magic, for protection, and because it makes her feel like herself. Beauty in ancient Egypt was not an afterthought. It was ritual. It was power. It was how one readied themselves for the gaze of the world and for their own reflection. This was true not just for women, but for men as well. The daily rituals of adornment belonged to everyone. In art, in letters, in tomb goods, we find evidence of a culture deeply invested in self-presentation, not as performance but as harmony. To live in balance with oneself was to care for the body, to scent the skin, to arrange the hair, to line the eyes. These acts were not indulgent, they were sacred. Let us sit beside them for a while, watch how they begin their days. In the corner of a home, small shelves are carved directly into the wall. Upon them, jars of oil, pastes, combs, and perfume. There is no rush. The morning is slow, the air still cool. A man runs a carved wooden comb through his hair, then ties a linen cloth over it. He cleans his teeth with a twig of palm and chews on mint. His wife braids her hair, not intricately, but carefully. Her daughter watches, wide-eyed, waiting for her turn. In this household, and in many others, beauty is not about transformation. It is about returning to one's natural self, realigning the outer with the inner, taking time to become whole before the day's labor begins. Egyptian cosmetics were born not in apothecaries, but in kitchens and gardens. Oils were pressed from castor beans, fenugreek, and almonds. Perfumes steeped in wine and left to age in clay pots. Coal was ground from minerals found along the desert cliffs, while henna leaves were dried and pounded into powder. The process was slow, deliberate, and as each material was prepared, it was blessed, if not formally, then quietly, with breath, with song, with intention. The application of these things was rarely utilitarian. It was sensual. The skin, warmed by oil, softened by unguents, responded not just with glow, but with memory. The body remembered care. It remembered the press of fingers, the rhythm of motion. It was a kind of love letter written daily to the self. And sometimes it was written for another. Sensuality in ancient Egypt did not rely on boldness. It lived in detail, in the gentle swish of a linen robe against the ankle, in the scent of a lover's neck long after they had left the room, in the faint trace of color on the lips, the gleam of oil on a man's shoulder after he returned from the river. Flirtation was not a game of conquest. It was an exchange of attention. A man might pause longer than necessary while passing a woman on a stairwell. She, in turn, might adjust her headscarf just enough to reveal the curve of her ear. No words, just presence, awareness, possibility. Poems from the time echo this gentleness. One fragment reads, "I saw you by the water jars. Your braid was loose, your foot bare. I forgot my father's name." Another, "She passed me like wind from the east. I carry her perfume in my chest. Even now I breathe her when I sleep." This was the nature of seduction in their world, not dramatic, not aggressive, but aromatic, rhythmic, slow, like the Nile. And when the body was finally offered to another, it came wrapped not in shame, but in beauty. Imagine now a young couple, newly joined. The room is dim, lit by a single lamp. They do not rush. They unwrap each other like gifts, admiring each detail. The curve of a collarbone, the freckle near the hip, the scent of resin on skin. There is laughter, low and shy. There is nervousness too, but also trust. They anoint each other with oil, not for function, but for tenderness. Their touch says, "I see you, I honor you. You are beautiful to me exactly as you are." Such rituals were not reserved for special nights. They were practiced again and again, woven into the fabric of long partnerships. Even years into a marriage, a woman might crush flowers into her bath, scenting her skin for a husband who had seen her 1,000 times. A man might shave carefully before returning home, rub his arms with scented fat. These acts were not requirements. They were gestures of continued desire. Because in ancient Egypt, desire was not something that burned hot and vanished. It smoldered, it lingered, it found new forms. A wife who could no longer bear children might still write poems to her husband. A man growing old might still press a kiss to his wife's hand as she served him lentils. These small moments were not less romantic. They were more so, weathered by years, smoothed by habit, thick with memory. Beauty aged, and in doing so it did not fade, it deepened. Art from the period shows this clearly. Not all figures are youthful. Some are rounder, softer, lined, but they are still adorned, still painted with care. The old did not retreat from beauty. They wore it with pride, and in death, these rituals continued. Bodies were washed with palm wine, perfumed with incense. The face was painted one final time, not to deceive, but to prepare, to be beautiful before the gods, to be recognized by those who had passed before, to look like oneself, even in stillness. For the Egyptians, the body was never separate from the soul. It was its house, its echo. To tend to the body was to tend to the spirit. And so, adornment was a spiritual act, a devotion, a prayer written in pigment and oil. Even the act of choosing what to wear each day had weight. Color mattered. White linen was cooling, pure and sacred. Red suggested vitality. Blue and green, rare, expensive, symbolized rebirth and life. Jewelry, too, carried meaning. A simple bead might be strung for fashion, but a scarab was for protection. A ring bearing a god's name was both an accessory and an amulet. A lover might give a lotus petal necklace, a husband, a charm inscribed with a blessing. These objects carried scent, heat, and memory. To wear them was to carry one another through the day. And when one partner died, the survivor might still wear these gifts, not as mourning, but as connection. To be adorned was not to be vain. It was to be seen, to be remembered, to be alive. So now, as we sit beside them, the women arranging their hair, the men smoothing the folds of their kilts, we do not see vanity. We see reverence for the body, for the moment, for each other. And for the soft, unspoken truth that beauty, real beauty, is simply the act of noticing, of touching with care, of seeing with love.